We have got ourselves a cracking OLED monitor. It's called the AOC Agon Pro AG276QZD, which sports a 26.5-inch flat WOLED 240Hz panel. It also has G-Sync compatibility, AMD FreeSync and HDR. At the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for roughly £880, while in the US it can be found for $800. In this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and to see how it compares to some of the other gaming monitors out there on the market. So to kick things off, let's talk about its input lag, and here it's very impressive at an objectively tested 0.7 milliseconds. Granted, it's not as low as the Asus alternative, which came in at 0.5 milliseconds, but the differences are negligible, specifically if you're considering the differences over here of 0.2 milliseconds. Indeed, over here, when I was playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I felt that my mouse inputs were absolutely flawless, and I had no issues whatsoever in terms of rendering my input. Now, the same could be said about its overall response time. Playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, which I do feel is quite intensive in terms of a hardcore competitive game, the monitor did an absolutely excellent job. Not only in terms of giving me fantastic response times, but also giving me a fantastic visual experience. And no, not just because of the overall OLED technology and the contrast ratio, but also because there is absolutely no overshoot. In order for me to demonstrate this, I have the OSRTT test, and here you can see that the RGB overshoot is pretty much set at 0. Similarly over here, the average initial time, which is often referred to as average G to G, was tested at a stonkingly low 0.74 milliseconds. You can see just above it over here that it hits 100% of the refresh rate window, which is what you'd come to expect from an OLED monitor, and where really it shines in comparison to LCD alternatives. Now, to expand on that point, you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test, and yes indeed there's no inverse ghosting. However, it is a shame that there is no motion blur reduction technology, like you'd find on some alternatives that use an IPS, VA or a TN panel. Indeed, some of the alternatives out there on the market, albeit not an OLED, will provide you better motion clarity when said technology is enabled. If the technology is not enabled, however, you will actually find that the overall motion clarity out of the box is slightly better on an OLED. So next up, I would like to talk about AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync technologies. And here the monitor has a VR range from 48Hz up to 240Hz, at least according to the manufacturer. Now, I was not able to test AMD FreeSync technology due to the fact that I have got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort, I found that I had no issues whatsoever while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. However, it's not all rosy, because when I played a game such as Destiny 2 and when I was in the menus and I had G-Sync enabled with or without HDR, I did notice that there was a little bit of flickering occurring. It wasn't overly severe and it didn't actually throw me off playing the game, but it's just something I thought I should note. Indeed, over here, this is a phenomenon that I did also encounter on the Asus alternative, but it seemed to be a lot more prominent in comparison to what I was experiencing with the AOC. Now, next up, we get onto its overall HDR experience, which yet again took me by surprise. See here, when I was comparing and contrasting from the Asus alternative that I'd previously reviewed, the AOC actually came out on top. Despite the fact that I actually only hit roughly 640 nits in terms of peak HDR brightness, at least in certain conditions, while the Asus alternative hit over 900 nits, the overall HDR color accuracy was actually far superior, and therefore meant that when I was playing a game such as Destiny 2, my overall experience was far superior and therefore a lot more positive. Now, don't get me wrong, both the Asus and the AOC, which is on review, cannot compete with QD-OLED monitors out there, nor full array local dimming mini LED IPS monitors. These monitors actually do a far superior job of giving you a real lifelike reproduction, and therefore if HDR is your top priority, you'll probably want to look elsewhere altogether. Past all of this, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. Now, I'd never recommend getting a 240Hz monitor if you're going to be solely using it for console gaming, but if you're going to be doing it on the side alongside a desktop computer, you'll be pleased to know that it will be able to run 1440p at 120Hz over its HDMI ports. Furthermore, you've also got a 4K signal input, and therefore I was able to note 4K at 60Hz with HDR while connected over to my 4K Blu-ray player, therefore showing a good sort of versatility, and it might be quite handy for certain console gamers out there. So the monitor's gaming performance is seriously impressive, but what about when it comes to the overall image quality? Well, as a reminder, it's got a 26.5-inch flat 240Hz 1440p WOLED panel. It also has a matte coating to it. Now, 3D Monitor's OSD, you have got dedicated sRGB and DCI-P3 modes, which of course I put through their paces. It is further great to see that both these modes also have full brightness controls, which is pretty much a rarity on any sort of AOC monitor, so I'm glad to see it's actually included with this one. Now, via the sRGB mode, I put it through the calibrators and I noted a gamut coverage of 94% in sRGB and a gamut volume of 96.9%. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. As for the average delta-E and maximum delta-E, they sit at 1.12 and 1.86 respectively, which means that this monitor can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. As for its tested contrast ratio, it's sat at infinity to 1, which is no surprise given the OLED technology. And as for the measured white point, it's sat at 5893 Kelvin at 100%, which isn't too far off the 6504 Kelvin target. As for its gamma curve, it sits pretty close to the 2.2 standard. So shifting to the dedicated DCI-P3 mode, you can see that the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes have been positively affected. Namely the latter, where it sits at 93.7% and 98.2% for the gamut coverage and gamut volume respectively. Now surprisingly, the average delta-E and maximum delta-E are actually very good as well, at 1.29 and 3.04. And yet again, this monitor can be used to work in the DCI-P3 color space, which is actually quite a rarity, specifically if you're looking at a gaming monitor. Now, as for its measured white point, it slightly shifts at 5926 Kelvin at 100%, and as for its gamma curve, it actually sits pretty close to the 2.6 standard, which is of course a little bit different from the 2.2 standard as what is required for the DCI-P3 color space. Apart from its impressive color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, as I did touch upon before, HDR brightness clocked in at 640 nits. This was in certain conditions, for example, a small white box in comparison to a dark background. As for HDR brightness, it came in at 392 nits. However, with the uniform brightness mode enabled, this does drop down to 243 nits, which is still perfectly usable, although worth noting that is a little bit dimmer. Now, as for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 2 nits, although with the uniform brightness mode, gets even lower at 1.2 nits. Now, this is the lowest figures that I've ever recorded to date for the minimum brightness of any sort of monitor, therefore showing absolutely excellent overall range for the monitor's brightness figures. Speaking of which, if you're going to be using the uniform brightness mode, you will be able to notice quite a dynamic shift in terms of the brightness. Now, this is a phenomenon that is also occurrent on other WOLED monitors, and you'll be able to quickly notice it when you're, for example, browsing the web and minimizing your browser or indeed any sort of window that you might have. Now, this is done to prevent any sort of OLED burn-in and tries to prolong the life of the monitor, which is actually good thinking from the manufacturer, but it does indeed take some getting used to. Thankfully, however, you can disable said behavior and therefore reduce the overall peak brightness of the monitor by enabling the uniform brightness modes. This effectively means that you're not going to have this kind of dynamic shift of brightness. This brings me on to brightness uniformity, which I do appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, but on my tested monitor, it didn't actually do too well. See, with the uniform brightness mode disabled, you'll be able to see that at the top right hand side, it doesn't fare all that well. While with the uniform brightness mode enabled, one might have expected far superior results, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Now, where it does really shine is when it comes to the overall backlight bleed. It is non-existent. Of course, due to being an OLED panel, it completely switches off its pixels and means that this image was taken in a completely pitch black room with a black image at full brightness. Yes, indeed, it does fare very well, but the same could be also said about full array local dimming monitors that are out there on the market. Now, before moving on, I would like to point out the limitations of owning a OLED monitor, or more specifically a WOLED with that subpixel layout. Now, first off, we have got burn-in. Indeed, over here, this is a topic that has surrounded televisions or monitors. Now, I've got no first-hand experience of using an OLED monitor for a prolonged amount of time, and by that I mean 1 to 3 years. However, even if I did, it would be unfair to associate said comments with this new AOC monitor, which of course uses a different panel. Still, the monitor manufacturer provides you quite a lot of preventive care in order to reduce the overall OLED burn-in effect. Now, some of which are actually enabled by default, while others will be enabled or disabled by you via the monitor's OSD. For example, the pixel refresh, which can be done manually via the monitor's OSD, can be done by pressing yes on the auto warning that pops up, and by the way, that is optional to have that display on your monitor, and can also be done automatically when the monitor enters a standby state or is powered off altogether. I actually did the latter, and therefore meant that I had no sort of downtime while using the monitor. Aside from all of this, I would also like to highlight that this monitor has a different subpixel layout than what you'll be accustomed to. For example, an IPS, VA or TN panel, or even QD-OLEDs. Indeed, the WOLED technology suffers from that fringing effect. Now, for those who are not aware, the fringing effect effectively means that the overall text will not look as clear. It almost looks like it has a sort of shadow behind it. And the effect is pretty much pronounced if you have colors as well. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see the images on your screen right now, where I was comparing and contrasting it from my daily driver, the AOC AG274QS, a 300Hz 1440p IPS monitor. And indeed over here, the high refresh rate monitor had no problems whatsoever when it came to text clarity, specifically when compared to the OLED that was on review. Now, with that said, when it came to the overall fringing effect, I will say that my overall experience of using this WOLED in comparison to the Asus WOLED just seemed a little better. I'm not really sure if that was just because it's my second time experiencing WOLED and therefore knowing kind of what to expect when it came to the overall fringing effect, or if the monitor manufacturer AOC have done some sort of implementation in order to reduce that effect actually occurring. Now, effectively what I'm trying to say over here is that the overall fringing effect didn't actually throw me off of using this monitor on a day-to-day basis. However, it did so when I was using the Asus alternative. So it's just some food for thought if you're comparing and contrasting between the two monitors. Now, with all that out of the way, I would like to talk about its build quality. And here it's got a four-side borderless design, and therefore means that the 26.5-inch panel won't take up too much space on your desk, and therefore it's certainly appreciated. It also has a very thin form factor due to that OLED technology. Now, the stand itself is very sturdy and provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. It also can be rotated in both directions, which is always appreciated. Now, what I really dislike, however, is the overall monitor's stand design. Indeed, over here it's asymmetrical, and it really did throw me off. I haven't actually gotten used to it, and it really does actually trigger my OCD a little bit. Those of you on social media also agreed with me, but I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. I just wish that AOC would have provided a regular square or rectangular shaped stand in comparison to the one that it's provided, let alone the triangular ones that I've seen in the past. Now, of course, you can replace the stand if you so wish with a VESA compatible stand, and therefore allows you to place it on a regular shaped stand or of course a monitor arm. On that note, I've never understood the point of having RGB lights on a monitor, but here they are on this AOC panel. Thankfully, however, you can reduce your power consumption and disable them altogether. And this can be done via the monitor's OSD that can be accessed through the small little joystick button found at the back of it. Now here, the OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right sort of options. Furthermore, you might have noticed that there is a volume option, and that is because the monitor has got two 5-watt speakers. They're not exactly tremendously good, but will suffice for basic music listening or Windows notifications. Now, if you do want to route audio through the monitor, you will be pleased to know that there is a 3.5mm jack output, which means you can plug in your headphones directly into the monitor. Speaking of inputs, you've got two HDMI 2.0 ports and two DisplayPort 1.4 ports. The latter will give you the full resolution and also refresh rate. However, the former will limit you to 144Hz. So just some food for thought if you're plugging it into a laptop, for example. You have also got two USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, which can be handy, for example, for plugging in peripherals. But of course here, if you do want to utilize them, you'll have to use the USB Type B to Type A cable, which is provided within the box. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict. And quite frankly, I've been left pretty impressed by the AOC Agon Pro AG276QZD. Indeed, it does a tremendous job when it comes to its input lag and response time. It operates at 1440p at 240Hz, therefore appealing to hardcore competitive gamers. It also has pinpoint color accuracy in both the sRGB and DCI-P3 spaces, and it also has a pretty nice design, albeit a pretty odd looking stand. You've also got a comprehensively laid out OSD. Couple this with a pretty competitive price where the manufacturers enter that, and it means that I can actually see myself actively recommending it. As such, it gets my Best Buy award. However, do bear in mind some of the limitations that I've mentioned throughout this review. For example, the fringing effect on WOLED panels in comparison to QD-OLED or, for example, regular IPS VA or TN panels. The fact that you also require quite a bit of TLC due to reducing the burn-in effect. Then the fact that there is a bit of flickering that can be noted with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled, at least that was present on my setup, and also the fact that the HDR experience is subpar in comparison to full array local dimming monitors or indeed QD-OLED alternatives. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of the monitor down in the comment section below. And of course, if you liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.